When I come down to the Georgia-Alabama border around Phenix City, it's usually to talk about the Phenix City mob and the mayhem of the 1950s. But to get more context, it's really interesting to actually look into the older history around here. And this home, the historic Penn Young home, dates back to 1850. It involves a family, the Godwins, who actually were somewhat involved in the Phenix City mob years. It's fascinating, and the house is said to be incredibly haunted. The man who commissioned this house was named William Penn Chandler Young, but most just called him Penn Young. He was a self-made man. His father, Arthur, came over to America around 1812. Now, he first settled in the West Indies and then in Florida, and finally he set roots down in Georgia. But before he was even 12 years old, Penn Young's father passed away, leaving him no inheritance. And at that point, Penn decided he had to become a self-made man. And he did this by marrying into a pretty prominent local family, the Godwin family, in 1846, taking the daughter Mary, and a couple years later going to California in search of gold. That was in 1849. Supposedly, he was mildly successful in that venture and came back to Georgia and wanted to settle down for a little bit before going back to California, but he was shown a piece of limestone. And he figured that if that limestone came from Russell County, it was very high quality stuff. So he moved out to the site that they found the lime at and realized that he could make this into an incredibly successful business venture. And using the money that he got from gold in California and from a prior merchant business in Girard, Alabama, he was a very successful man. He lived lavishly. Now, I believe that he was probably in the gold fields when he heard of this new business venture, and figuring it was on his home turf, he decided to come back and start this business with the money that he'd made out in California. In any case, they commissioned an enslaved man, the property of his stepfather, John Godwin, to build this home. That man's name was Horace King, a fascinating character to be sure, and I've done a video in the past about him. I'd like to talk about him a little bit more because John Godwin was that man's owner. John Godwin is the seed of the beginnings of the Dixie Mafia, the Phenix City mob. In these last three lines, the love and gratitude he felt for his lost friend and former master. Penn Young's stepfather, John Godwin, passed away in 1859, leaving all of his property to his daughter Mary and her new husband. This included the enslaved people that he kept, including Horace King, who by that point was known as a master builder throughout the entire South, and he'd already constructed this home and would later go on to construct the mental asylum and the still-standing Alabama State House. He built a huge number of beautiful covered bridges that are still celebrated to this day throughout all of the Southeast, and the business that was operated by Penn Young continued up through the early 1870s. But with this money that he made, especially selling lime to the Confederacy, he was a non-frugal spender. He lived very lavishly, he had large parties, and he was known, at least in local folklore, as a tough driver. He was very rough on the people that worked for him, and in many cases, those were the help. Local black men who were once slaves and now were basically in indentured servitude to the Young family. And I do want to point out that Mary insisted on freeing the former slave of her father, John Godwin, and Horace King continued working for the family. Penn Young died in 1878, but it's unclear, at least in official records, specifically how he passed. All the locals in the area will tell you that he was killed on the 13th wooden stair of the staircase in this home by somebody who was hiding in a cubby waiting to spring out. He was stabbed and then beheaded. Now, according to local legend, because Penn Young was so rough on the black folks that worked for him, a lot of people had it out for him. And because he was so rough on them, it kind of got covered up and never really discussed, because the unspoken understanding is a lot of people understood when someone killed someone as tough as Penn Young, maybe the police wouldn't look into it. Well, you might be saying, John, that's a very interesting story, but what does it have to do with the Phenix City mob? Let me explain. John Godwin was essentially the archetype of a Southern aristocrat, but the conditions socially in this part of the Deep South were a little bit more liberal. See, Godwin didn't have much of a problem mixing with his slaves. A lot of people said that Horace King was half Catawba and half African, but it's very obvious, at least to locals in the area I've spoken to, many of the enslaved people here had fairly open relationships with their masters. In fact, Horace King built a beautiful monument over John Godwin's burial spot when he passed away, using his own money, showing affection for the man who was his former master. A lot of people felt open in living with the enslaved folks, and this was not something seen too commonly across the Deep South. Horace King would later go on, even as a black man, to be a politician in Alabama in the 1870s, and the Penn family owned that business that aided the Confederacy. Naturally, a lot of money stayed in the Godwin family, and during the Phenix City mob's heyday, the boss of all of Phenix City was a man named J. Godwin Davis, of the Godwin family, and his son, Bubber Davis, ran the gambling operations. So this stayed in the family for generations.
In a quarter mile, you will arrive at your...
Columbus officers Dick Adams and William Jackson were killed as they attempted to arrest a man for disorderly conduct here at the corner of 1st Avenue and 13th Street. Nowadays, obviously, it looks a whole lot different than it did back in 1896. But just over the bridge there is Phenix City, Alabama, a haven for lawlessness. And we're going to go to those officers' graves and talk a little bit more about that incident. Officers William Jackson and Richard Adams were killed attempting to arrest that man for disorderly conduct right here on the corner of 13th and 1st Avenue on the Georgia side of the river. Both the man and his son opened fire and killed the two officers, one of whom died a couple days later, before fleeing on foot to their home along 16th Street, but they were followed by an angry mob. Pretty soon, officers arrived to prevent a lynch mob, but the suspects began firing from the windows and doors, killing another officer, Charlie Roberts, and wounding one of the constables. The mob then stormed the home, shooting and killing the father, dragging his body into the front yard and burning him. Dragging his body into the front yard and burning what remained of him. His son escaped out the back as the mob emptied their revolvers into his dad, but Alabama cops arrested him very quickly, and he was extradited to Georgia and hanged for the crime. On May 20th, 1920, officers Charles Harvey and James Stokes were shot at this street corner attempting to arrest a suspected liquor runner. This is the corner of 5th Avenue and 16th Street in Phenix City. Harvey died immediately and Stokes died 2 days later. The suspect fled, but was soon arrested and executed for the crime. And this is the old Russell County Courthouse in Seal, Alabama. It was the county seat and courthouse until 1943. So when you hear about some of the earlier iterations of the Russell County mob or the Phenix City Mafia, the Dixie mob, this is where that would have taken place. Many a trial must have been held here with the early members of the Dixie Mafia. It's fascinating to think of all of the stars that had to align to allow this place to be the epicenter of organized crime. After all, you had mills on one side of the river, you had working camps on the other side of the river, you had varying prohibition laws, and a restructuring of the local politics that was going on for generations. For a while, Seal, Alabama was the seat of Russell County, and then for a while after that, it was basically the town of Girard was the epicenter of organized crime, because that's where alcohol was coming in from Georgia, where it was legal, sort of a reversal of what we saw in the heyday of Phenix City story, where people in Georgia would go over to Phenix City for their alcohol. All of these stars must have aligned perfectly. And this is the inside of the old Russell County Courthouse in Seal before that county seat transferred over to Phenix City. It does make me sad to see all of these historic sites that would be perfect for museums, kind of neglected over the years. You can see some photos inside of there as well of different local politicians. You can tell that they tried for a little while to turn it into something, but nothing ever panned out. And it looks like this was the old jail cell for people waiting for trial. And look at that big stack of old records. It's also obvious they're keeping the AC running, so hopefully one day this nice courthouse will be a museum celebrating this sort of rural part of Alabama along the Chattahoochee River. And sure enough, in the shadow of the old Seal Russell County Courthouse, you've got the Methodist Church, which has the grave of Norwood Bickerstaff, who was killed just before Christmas, 1913, the result of a feud over a sort of secret society or cult initiation. It was the middle of the night in mid-December 1913 that some sort of secret induction into a fraternal order was taking place at a barn in Chattahoochee, Alabama, just west of Columbus. Norwood Bickerstaff, who's buried here, was a member of this fraternal order. The initiation was held in a building owned by J. Dyke DeLacy, but apparently they didn't have his permission to use the building. When DeLacy walked out of his home and saw them lighting fireworks, one launched off and landed right next to him before exploding. He approached the group, and Norwood began to fight with him. DeLacy stated that he would shoot the man who touched him, and Norwood reached out and laid a finger on him. DeLacy pulled out his revolver and shot him. He then shot his brother, who was lunging forward, and wounded another man in the leg. Papers reported that prior to this, DeLacy applied for membership to the supposed fraternity, but was rejected. I suspect it might be the Klan, but papers are kind of vague on what this group was. The Klan was very popular around this area because they were able to leverage social issues like alcoholism and get people to turn towards their particular brand of white Protestant Christianity. And in the shadow of DeLacy's grave, you've got a couple of interesting headstones made of, I believe they call this white bronze or zinc. It's specific to a very small span of time, and it was very popular at that era. Kind of cheap, but it lasts, and it doesn't look too bad. This church itself was set up along the old Federal Road, and I believe George Williams Dudley Jr., he must have been something like a historian for this to be his grave marker, an old millstone. Being just north of the Federal Road, it would have had protection against Indian raids up until the time they were removed after the Second Creek War in the late 1830s. But this is a fascinating, very, very interesting area. And even just the fact that communities sort of coalesced around here in the aftermath of the Indian Wars contributed a lot to the rough and tumble character of communities like this. We're here at the grave of Clyde Knowles, who was at one point mayor of Girard, Alabama, and I wanted to talk about this because it shows that in the beginnings, the Phenix City mob was essentially reversed, and the attempt to avoid a situation in which alcohol was flowing from Columbus, Georgia, over the state line into a state with bone-dry prohibition laws, it backfired, and ironically created the Phenix City mob in Russell County. By 1916, the state of Alabama recognized that Georgia, with its lax liquor laws, was openly selling booze across the Chattahoochee, specifically in Girard, Alabama. And this was something that local community leaders were fine with because it didn't seem to harm the community all that much compared to the benefits it brought. So, in May, the state decided to send 40 hand-picked state troopers because they realized that local cops wouldn't do anything to solve the issue, on train from Montgomery all the way up to Girard. Now, because police were respected much more, even by 1950s standards, when the Phenix City mob was at its height, people stood around and watched when, at 8 a.m., they began to dump the barrels into the Chattahoochee, equaling about $1 million in today's money. By the mid-afternoon, about 4,000 people stood by to watch the event unfold, and one of them was a very young Clyde Knowles, who would go on to be mayor of Girard, Alabama. The raids of 1916 really didn't accomplish much other than being a media sensation, and by 1923, Knowles was mayor. This was a rallying cry for evangelicals around the country, as Prohibition was still in vogue with them, and a tent revival began in town. And in front of everybody, Mayor Knowles walked up and explained to the preacher that the situation was beyond his control. He would stop it if he could, but he feared for his own safety. He thought that he would be assassinated by basically these rum runners, and this was noticed by the state government. At that time as well, Knowles also had ties to the Freemasons and connections with high society, as did many people in the Southeast, especially in local government. The interaction between the mayor of Girard and the evangelical preacher left a real impression on a local deputy who decided on his own, without any orders to go down to a nearby liquor store that was operating openly but illegally, arrest the owner, and shut the store down. He was shot 4 times but survived, and other officers came to arrest both the deputy and the liquor store owner. This was something that attracted the governor's attention, who arrived to town, greeted by an unruly crowd of about 8,000 people. The speech that he gave in Girard was totally impromptu, and the whole event was pretty funny in hindsight. The governor would later say he felt that Girard was under mob rule when he began speaking, and he suggested that they could solve things with love. That's a direct quote. Why don't you just solve things with love? Now, this had been going on for generations, and this whole area of Alabama was a lawless haven. People began to heckle the governor, and without prompting, he said, well, if you want a real solution, we could consolidate this town with Phenix City that has a much lower crime rate and a much less corrupt local government. Immediately, people said, that's actually a really good idea. And watching all of this, one of the men that was involved behind the scenes was Girard Mayor Knowles. And if we want to do a video more about just random sporadic violence that might not be organized crime that happened along the Chattahoochee, I think I should mention Patsy Smith Landreau, who died in an apparent possible murder-suicide, but it still seems to be unsolved, in 1979. See, on October 10th, 1979, the Columbus Inquirer reported that authorities were probing 2 deaths for what they believe could have been a murder-suicide. On the 8th, the body of retired Chief Warrant Officer Clarence Gabbard was found with a .22 caliber gunshot to his chest. He was on the floor of his business, the Colbert General Store in Chattahoochee. Gabbard was a veteran of both Korea and Vietnam. Authorities immediately remarked that it probably wasn't a suicide, nor was robbery a motive. Initially, papers implied he was only shot once in the chest. 2 days later, the body of Patsy Landreau was found near the Russell County Mount Sinai Church in her car on the highway, apparently dead of an overdose. Their deaths seem to have happened around the same time. Some odd circumstances exist around this, such as the fact that papers reported she was on the highway and had been dead there for 2 days before she was found by a lineman. How you could be dead on the side of the road in your vehicle for so long is kind of a mystery to me. When she was found overdosed, authorities claimed the two were connected and revealed that Gabbard had multiple gunshot wounds, breaking from the initial story. They also claimed they found a .22 caliber pistol in her purse and suspected she had committed suicide after murdering him. There was a note found which indicated she intended to take her own life, but it didn't mention anything about the killing of Gabbard. Police said there would be delays until crime reports came back. It seemed like an open and shut case. They had the pistol and were sending it out to get it tested, but no further updates were posted in the papers about the case, as far as I know at least, and it was never really officially solved. Gabbard was divorced from his wife and leasing this store from his stepfather. Oh my gosh, he's huge. We've come out to Crumley's Chapel in Trickley, Cleburne County, eastern Alabama, to look for the Deputy Sheriff Bud Willingham, who was killed in a high-speed chase in 1962. But to kind of demonstrate just the high crime rate in this area of the eastern part of the state, you've got here the grave of Ashley Nicole Lindsay. I can't make out the smaller tombstone here, but it seems handmade, and you can see the word arson. And here it says, "You were murdered in cold blood. Gone too soon. Wish you were here." That was only in 2021. I've come out to Crumley's Chapel in Trickham near the state line to tell you the story of Bud Willingham, a deputy sheriff here in Cleburne County who died in 1962 in a high-speed chase. Something that goes underappreciated by Southern historians is just how prevalent bootlegging was in this part of the state until relatively recently. The fact that it was right on the state line made jurisdiction a whole lot harder to determine, and the rural nature of it made sure that law enforcement didn't modernize until relatively recently. It was on April 30th of 1962 that Deputy Sheriff Troy Clifton Willingham, more commonly known as Bud Willingham, got into a high-speed chase with a car he suspected of bootlegging. Now, into this chase at a place called Abel's Gap, his car flipped over several times, and his passenger was wounded, but Troy Clifton Willingham was crushed under the weight of the car. Sure enough, right after the deputy sheriff got into a crash, the car they were pursuing plowed into the side of the road about a mile up the street, and the suspect was seen getting out and running into the woods. Now, at that time in Alabama, you had civil rights as a major concern, and it was 1962, and people sighted a black man fleeing into the woods. They found some moonshine in the floor of his vehicle, and after a massive manhunt, they tracked him down and brought him to the jail in Heflin, the county seat. Melv Laminack is one of those fascinating men whose story is lost but all to the older generation and to newspaper archives. He was born in this county in 1912 and quickly took to a life of crime. He was only 16 years old when he was arrested for bootlegging and sentenced to a year in jail. But when he got out in 1930, he married his wife, a faithful partner who stuck with him until he was assassinated in 1978. Molly Laminack really tried to help her husband organize his life, and the two had a son together, but unfortunately Melv seemed to be in and out of jail for many years. In 1932, he and Manuel Laminack, who I would assume is his brother, were both in the prison when they petitioned the governor of Alabama for a pardon in separate columns right next to each other. So pretty obvious they were in and out of correctional facilities for many years. He was again arrested in 1937, and then in 1952, I believe, he was a part of a three-man team that bust his friend out of the local jail in Heflin, and he was arrested on charges of bigamy. So they helped him get back across the state lines and disappear into Georgia, and Melv again was arrested for breaking someone out of jail. By the mid-1950s, it seemed like Melv's life was taking a turn for the better, and he was interviewed by the papers about his son Edward participating in an Army Air Force program. Basically, his son had gone off and become a veteran, and he was very, very proud of his boy. However, in 1973, in a rather cheeky way, he and his old bootlegging buddy, a man named C.N. Owens, sued the county treasurer. That man's name was Ballinger, and they sued under the idea that, according to the Alabama Constitution, if your county has a population of less than 56,000, you don't need a treasurer. And he argued that Ballinger was just taking taxpayer money and essentially that the whole operation was one big graft. Sadly, in 1977, it would seem as though Laminack's life took a very downward turn. His son Edward died in a car crash in South Carolina, and very shortly after that, a man came to visit him, a man named Kenneth Lee Clayton, and for some reason, the elderly Melv Laminack pulled out a .38 revolver and in his own home shot Kenneth Clayton. Before it could make it to trial, Melv Laminack was going to retrieve his mail, and he was shot down by unknown assassins. His wife died only weeks later, and panning through the cemetery, you can see this is basically half Laminacks, a huge family on the state line. I'd like to know the connection between Melv Laminack and Kenneth Lee Clayton, because I wouldn't be surprised at all if his death came as a result of genuinely exposing corruption here in Cleburne County. Perhaps Clayton was involved, but I have no idea. He could have been set up, and then he was assassinated, ambushed as he went to go retrieve his mail. And you can see here on the state line where Melv Laminack is buried that this part of rural Alabama was constantly plagued by disease outbreaks and basically just famines. These are all pauper graves in front of the Lutheran Church, and I'd like to know more about the history of the Laminack family. Contemporary papers didn't really make clear the connection Melv Laminack had with Kenneth Lee Clayton, who was shot in his home, but I wouldn't be surprised in the slightest to find out that this was actually a setup because Melv was immediately released from jail and was shot as he went to get his own mail. Perhaps this actually was an assassination of someone exposing government corruption or someone taking care of old competitors, because Melv Laminack was basically the bootleg king of Cleburne County, or at least he once was before he was murdered in 1978.